Hi, I'm Adam Forbes. I'm the author of Corporate Escapology and now the host of Corporate Escapology the Podcast. It's a podcast to help people get inspired by other people's journeys, leaving corporate life and moving on to do something completely different. Normally I'd have a guest with me to hear their story, but for this inaugural podcast, I thought what would be better would be to just explain why I'm doing the podcast, who I hope to help through the podcast, and the kind of content we're going to be talking about on the podcast. I spent about 20 years working inside companies and also with companies from outside as a consultant. And I left my job 3 years ago. And since then, I've been still working with lots of corporate people. It's a big part of my life. It's a big part of what I do and the capabilities that I've developed. And what I've observed during that time is that corporate people are an interesting bunch of people. They're usually very bright, smart, capable people. But what happens over time is anybody doing the same job day after day, year after year, their confidence starts to erode. It's sort of insidious. It doesn't happen quickly, usually. It happens over a long period of time where we haven't really noticed it. But then all of a sudden, we start noticing that maybe we don't apply for something because we think, maybe I wouldn't get that job. Maybe I can't get that job. Maybe the skills I've got are so specialized and so unique to the role that I've got today, or they're just relevant for this company or this industry. And so we start getting a bit sort of smaller and shrinking our sense of self, when really at work, we may actually be quite a big leader. So I've observed this over the years and started doing research on it and really building up an understanding of what was going on there. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that we're not tested in the same way. So if you're flipping jobs all the time, you're going out into the market, you're getting a sense of your value outside. You're also looking back at yourself fairly frequently and saying, what can I offer? So you're kind of building the data that says, actually, I'm pretty good and I'm pretty valuable because I'm testing that outside. But if you stay in a job for 5, 6, 7, 10 plus years, you start to believe that what you do here is all you can do. And then, of course, what happens then is we start to feel very grateful to our employer that we've got the job. I know from my experience, frequently I would look at marketing director roles which were comparable to the ones I was doing in my corporate job, and look at them on LinkedIn, and I would think, oh my gosh, I could never do that. I could never demonstrate that I've done some of those things. And of course, that's true in many ways. Flipping to a completely different industry, even if you're a marketing leader, that is quite challenging. But what we often do is then we just retreat back and say, oh gosh, I'm very, very glad to have this job and I better just keep my head down. And if you're not careful, years go past and you miss out on other opportunities. And that may be fine. You may want that career. You may really want to just keep rising up steadily, although of course there are fewer posts to apply for. So the likelihood is that most of us will sort of plateau at a point in our career. But many of us, and I think the pandemic kind of was a big marker in many people's lives, started wondering whether there was more that they should be doing with their lives. And what I firmly believe is the skills and experiences and capabilities and knowledge that people have in corporates can be packaged up and sold to others outside those corporates, and both sides can get a lot of value from that. The individual can get more value from that, and the company can get value from all the expertise and capabilities that you bring. And I think one of the things I've really recognized myself having left my corporate job is that I haven't properly left a lot of the brand and the identity, as well as the capabilities that I developed at that corporate's expense. I carry that with me to the next jobs. Invariably I introduce myself as X, or when I was at, so you throw these things in and you're using them all the time. And it's because you are using them all the time. You're drawing on those experiences all the time. And so what I want to do is, through the book, is to help people who want to leave to see that they can. And instead of seeing it as a huge leap and high risk and kind of reckless if you've got big responsibilities, which many of us do at this sort of age, instead make it a series of smaller jumps that when the final one comes, and you exit your corporate job, you do it much more safely, much less taking fewer risks, and a much greater chance of success because of that. And so one of the things that I've noticed talking to corporate people is that they don't always know what they want to do afterwards. And so they default to some kind of fairly bland boxes and generic job titles, a consultant or a coach, or I might be an entrepreneur. And sometimes they go down a path looking at that, and then again they retreat because they haven't really got granular enough about some of those job titles and roles and projects and other kinds of things that they could get involved in. And so one of the things I want to do through this podcast is shine a light on what other people are doing and help people like you see that they're doing it, so why couldn't you? But also help you see how they've got there. So the steps that they have taken, and you might get some insight into different kinds of, an inspiration maybe, into different kinds of roles that you could consider. So for example, I think of like a consultant is a classic exit point for somebody in a corporate. It makes a lot of sense. You can make quite a lot of money without having to give lots of time. But there's a really broad spectrum of consultants, from the McKinsey type that's full-time, that is pretty much like working for another corporate again, except probably many more hours and much more pressure. Going right down to an individual who's going and helping some small businesses with a particular niche that they can add, through which they can add value. Maybe they know something about some software, or they know something about a process, or they know something about a function like marketing, and they can go in and they can provide some expertise just on their own. There's no kind of overheads associated with it. There's no other people involved. They're just operating as a lone consultant. And there's a big spectrum in between there of people working in partnerships in different groups with people that are working with complementary skills and offering services to bigger companies because they've got a broader range of services that they can offer. So there's lots and lots of different things people do. And there's some surprising things that people are doing that I've spoken to, that I've included in the book, and I'm wanting to include in the podcast too, so they can tell their stories. So I'm hoping you're going to get inspired by other people's stories. And I hope you're also going to build your confidence that if they've been able to make these moves, why shouldn't you? So that's the purpose of the podcast. Over the next every 3 weeks, I'm going to release a podcast, and I've been speaking to some great people already. People are doing some really, really interesting things. And quite frankly, it's only because of their corporate experience that they're able to do some of it. And that, I think, is the really, really interesting thing. This isn't a sort of pivot away from everything you've ever known. It's just bringing it all with you and repurposing, repackaging it so you can offer it to somebody else. Sometimes you might even be offering it back to your own company that used to be your employer. And in some ways, I've spoken to people who found that experience gets them a lot of the joy that they had of working within the corporate without some of the things that they didn't enjoy so much. The politics and some of the bureaucracy. From outside, things are quite different. So I think there's lots of different avenues to explore here. It's not as simple as just like jumping and becoming a coach, retraining and becoming a coach, or being a consultant. Lots of different avenues I want to explore with you. And hopefully at the end of it, you may say, right, I want to go and get ready for this now. This seems exciting. I can see a pathway to it, and I'm going to go for it. And I'm going to de-risk it so that when I'm ready to jump, I'm fully prepared and the landing is going to be as safe as possible. So join me every 3 weeks, subscribe to the podcast, and you'll hear a different story that will hopefully inspire you, build your confidence, and get you ready to exit your corporate job.